We'd like to begin with a blessing, and to do that this morning, I'm going to ask Stuart.
Aloha, everybody. Well, I invite you to take a nice deep breath and to close your eyes and to help bring you into this place, into this very moment. First, I would invite you to breathe in with your focus on top of your head and breathe out with your focus on your navel. And do a couple rounds of this, if you would. And now, find some part of your body that feels really, really good right now. It could be your back, your bottom, your big toe, your left ear, anything that feels really, really good, and just let your attention stay right there with that part of your body. It feels very, very good. And let that feeling permeate the rest of your body and the rest of your being. And let that feeling spread out beyond your body to all of your surroundings. And enjoy the blessing of aloha, connection to all, and the connection to the deepest parts of yourself. And when you're ready, come on back. Mahalo.
Mahalo. Good. After the blessing, we like to begin with a story. So I'm going to start that story right now. Ika kahiko, mamua o Kapenakuke. Once upon a time, long before Captain Cook, the only people who lived on the island of Kauai lived in two villages in the more southern part, central and southern. And they were in the district that's called Waimea. Now it'll be helpful to know, Kauai is almost round. So you can think of it like that. At the very north, directly north, is the beautiful Hanalei Bay. Okay? Over on the east side is, well actually let's go south. Directly south, pointing south, is the resort area of Poipu. Okay? Over on the east side is the mouth of the Wailua River, very sacred area in Polynesia and in the lore and legends of Kauai. Then directly over on the far west part is a missile base at a place called Barking Sands. Are you familiar with Barking Sands? Anybody doesn't know what that means? There are some places in the world, I know of a place in Michigan actually, but there's on Kauai too. There are places where for some reason the sand is of such a consistency that it traps air inside it. And when you walk on the sand or you walk on the slopes, the pressure of your feet causes sometimes it's woof, woof, woof as you walk, and that's why they call it Barking Sands. The Hawaiian name for that area is Nohili. So that's when we say barking sands. That's a particular area where that happens. Well, the reason that's kind of significant for our story is because at this time that we're talking about, some misunderstanding happened between the two villages and they were at war. And they used to trade with each other. Now, one of these villages, okay, here's Kauai, right? One of these villages was located in a canyon that branched off of the main Grand Canyon of the Pacific, it's called, okay? Waimea Canyon, which almost splits the island right down the middle. Well, one of these branches is called Kauai. And so one of the villages was based at the mouth of that canyon. Susan and I know Kauai very well because when we were trying to hike up to the center and top of the mountain in Waialeale, we had to cross that valley and climb up the other side. But that's where they were located. The other one, down south, near where the Waimea River goes into the ocean, was another village. We'll call that one Waimea. Okay? But they were at war because of some great misunderstanding that happened. And like I said, they used to trade with each other. The people, there are a lot of things, but the people in general in Kauai, it's not an easy word to pronounce, so I'm going to call it Kauai. But they would trade because they had wood and they had the forests, and they would trade paddles, and they would trade forest products that were needed by the people of the ocean. The people of ocean, they would trade fish and mats that they made out of materials that grew along the coast. Okay? Particularly the mats would be from the hala tree. So, but this time neither one of them could have any of that stuff, and even though they were suffering, this war that they had just kept them apart. Okay? So, around about this time, there was a family living on the border between the two village areas. And they decided, the mother and father, they just had a new baby. And they decided to make the baby safe, they had to take her out of there because they were right in the war zone. So they climbed the mountains. The central part of Kauai has these high mountains, about 5,000 feet. And so they had to cross those mountains, and over on this other edge, northwestern edge, is a place called Napali today. Okay? It means the cliffs, and very steep canyons and very steep cliffs. And there's one of them there that's called Nualolo Uka. And Nualolo Uka is a very steep walled valley with no entrance to the sea. Okay? Uka means upland. And so it's very protected, but the only way down into it was a rope ladder. So the family went there and they got to the point, and the father got on the ladder and the mother was handing the baby to him, and just as she handed the baby to him, it was a little girl, their daughter, she slipped out of her tapa blanket and was plunging down the cliff. Now, if the obvious happened, we wouldn't have any more story to tell. But in those days, the Hawaiian gods were a lot closer to the people than they are anymore. And so the goddess of the rainbow, Anuenui, was in that location, and she caught the baby, enveloped her in clouds, and bore her off. It often happens that when the gods would save somebody from a certain death, they couldn't keep them in the same place for some reason. Okay? But a lot of legends have that. So she took this girl away. The parents watched all of this. So, of course, they went into grief because the child was gone. On the other hand, they were joyful that she wasn't dead. Okay? So kind of a mixed thing there. So the goddess of the rainbows took her all the way over the Great Canyon, all the way up to the upper end of that Kauai Canyon, and up there and put her in what's called a hanging valley. Now, a hanging valley, it's important you understand what this means, too. Kauai has a lot of them. We don't see too many on this island. When there's steep cliffs and there's waterfalls plunging down, what the waterfalls will do sometime is carve out a little valley when they meet some hard rock on the way down. And so it forms a pool, and it forms a short stream, and then the water plunges over the cliff again. So that area up there is called a hanging valley. And some of these hanging valleys, behind the waterfall will be a cave, the remains of a lava tube. Okay? Well, this is what happened with this valley on Kauai. So Anui, the goddess, brought the girl and had her fixed up a home for her behind the cave, but she also, could play in the valley and do what she wanted. And she was taught by the goddess of rainbows, she was taught all the secrets of rain. She could call up any kind of rain she wanted. And when people came and were from the down below for the village of Kauai, some people started coming up to see, they knew something had happened, they saw her, she was so beautiful, always surrounded by rainbows. And so they thought of her, started treating her almost like a goddess, and they brought her food offerings. But with some people, of course, weren't so nice for whatever reason. That always happens with human beings. But those people, she would bring a little thunderstorm down on them, and they wouldn't bother her anymore. So this went on for a while until she got the reputation of being wise. Some people brought their problems to her, and she would help them solve her problems, until they started to look on her as their kind of a natural leader. Not officially a chiefess, but a natural leader of the people. Okay? So this went on for a while. Finally, news about this rainbow woman trickled through people as it usually does and made its way all the way to the village of Waimea, down further south. And they started wondering about this, and who was this woman? And she was always called so beautiful. And there was a lot of discussion, especially by the chief of Waimea and his wife, the chiefess. And the reason there was so much discussion, because they had a son whose name was Kuluiua. And they were very concerned about him because he wasn't married. He was past the age where young men would normally get married, and he was the chief and the heir, and he didn't seem to have any interest in the women. And all the beautiful women, were trying to get his eye, and they wanted to be, married to him, but he had no interest. So the mother went to him, the chiefess, she went to him, and she says, hey, maybe you should go see this woman. She might be a good woman to marry. She's beautiful. He says, I've seen a lot of beautiful women. What do I want to go see another one for? And she says, well, this one's different. How different? A woman's a woman. This one's always surrounded by rainbows. And he stopped. He said, this I've got to see. Okay. So he did get interest, and he went up. However, remember, they were still at war here. So he had to go by a roundabout trail to come to Kauai Canyon from the other side. And he made his way to the Hanging Valley. And as he came through some bushes, whoa, there was this girl on a rock, and she was stunning. Her hair was flowing down her back like a waterfall down a cliff. Her face was round and bright like the moon. Her skin was all glistening wetly with colors of the rainbow. Wow, he had instant falling in love. And he said, he came out and she saw him and smiled, and he said, I love you, come be my wife. And she laughed, but she didn't laugh at him. She actually laughed with delight, so it didn't make him angry, it felt good. But she said, I will come to you when you can tell me my true name. And he says, okay. Rainbow. Nope. Waterfall. Nope. He looked around. Flower. Nope. Shook his head. He couldn't think of anything. She laughed again and went back into her cave. So he was dejected, and so he came back down, made his way back down to Waimea village, sought out the wisest people he could find in the village about this woman. Who could they think of what her name was? And every time somebody gave what he thought was a good suggestion, he'd run back up into the mountains and go to the valley, and he'd say the name, and she would shake her head sadly and go back into her cave. This happened over and over again. And the chief and the chiefess, they called for all the kahunas and the seers and the magicians and everybody to try and figure out what this girl's name was, and no one could do it. So the guy, Kuluiua, was getting so discouraged and so upset that he stopped eating. He wouldn't take any food. He wouldn't take any drink. He got weaker and weaker. And finally, he was really on the verge of dying. His mother and father were grieving for him because they expected him to go very soon. But there was one woman, or one person, she was a woman, that they never asked. And this was his grandmother. Because the mother and her mother had had some silly argument. You know, these were people who had problems with relationships. But, so they had, and so she wasn't even supposed to come into the compound. But one day she came in. She was a powerful woman, wise woman. Her name was Kamu. And so she came in and she sat down next to her grandson, although the parents were glaring at her. They didn't dare do anything because of her power. And she said to the boy, she said, "What are you doing there? Get up, go back up to the mountains, tell the girl her name, and marry her." He said, he's whispering because he's so weak. He says, "I don't know her name. I've tried 400 names, and none of them are right. No one knows her name." And the grandmother laughed. She says, "Well, that's silly, I do." And he says, "Tell me, tell me." And she says, "Well, not like that." He says, "I don't care if you gave me 4,000 names. I wouldn't marry you if you look the way you do right now. You get up, you get you some flesh on your bones, and you become a man worthy of a woman like that." So that stirred him up. And so he called for food and drink, and he got up, and he began exercising, and he began walking, and he began playing, and he began having fun until he was better than he ever had been. And finally the grandmother thought he was ready. And she said, "Okay, now you're ready, and I'll tell you her name. It's the same as yours. Your name is Dripping Rain. Hers is Rain. Ua." And he's, okay, so he runs back up into the mountains, goes over to the cave, comes out, and he calls out, "Ua." And she comes running out. He says, "Ua, come be my wife." And she says, "You've called me by my true name. I will come and be your wife." And so they came and they got married and they had this huge wedding. And because they were both from the two different villages, of course, that got all the villagers together and everybody forgave everybody. And they ruled the people for a long, long lifetime of peace and prosperity and happiness. Pipiholo ke ka'au. So goes the story. Okay. Now, this brings us into the topic. We had a few examples of it in this story, examples of grief, but we're going to talk about grief now and how to heal it in some different ways. In order to do that, we have to start off by having a real clear understanding of what grief is. And I find among many people this is a problem. So we'll start off with this. I'll just take some notes here. Okay. First, you've got to understand, and this sounds obvious, of course, but grief is always associated with loss of some kind. That's what grief has to do with, loss. Most of the time, we associate it with the loss of a close member of the family or the loss of a close friend. But people can grieve for any kind of loss, anything that affects them emotionally. So people can grieve for the loss of a famous person that they've never met. We've seen this recently with Steve Jobs, and we've seen this recently with Michael Jackson. The grieving for Elvis is still going on. And yet, there are other famous people who have died who don't get that same kind of widespread grieving process. Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, a lot of male movie stars recently. But when a person identifies with someone, like I say, they don't have to know them, but when they have a personal identification or they feel great emotional attachment to something they do, like there's actually a term for Macintosh people who, they're called Mac addicts. When there's a strong emotional attachment to something related to the person, the music or whatever it might be, then there's a true grieving. But why? What's really going on here? Before we say that, we'll have to also mention that people can grieve over the loss of a fortune, over the loss of a home or a job, or even the loss of a way of life. Let's look at the psychology of grief, because this is going to tell us where it comes from in the first place. The psychology of grief has to do with mental resistance to some significant change. Because that's what loss really is. Loss is a change. Now, resistance to change is natural. Okay? It's part of our life, it's part of our health, actually. But the pain and emotional symptoms that accompany the loss aren't necessary. The more significant the change is to us, the more it causes changes in our patterns of thinking and feeling and acting, the greater the resistance to that loss. And a great loss causes great disruptions in our patterns, and therefore it causes great resistance. Now what happens is these symptoms that I talk about that can occur with it are directly related to the mental resistance, because mental resistance to something produces physical resistance in the body. And physical resistance, when it's strong enough, can cause all kinds of physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, and then it circles around and causes mental symptoms again. It's been my experience, well, let's put it this way first. The intensity of grief and the duration of grief, how long it lasts, is entirely dependent on how we think about the loss and how often we keep remembering and resisting the consequences of that loss. In other words, the effect it had on changing our patterns. It's been my experience in working with a lot of people in the grief process that intense and prolonged grief almost always has a strong aspect of anger that goes along with it. It can be anger at the person who's gone. It can be anger at someone involved in the loss. It can be anger at the fact that something is no longer part of our life. But the thing that keeps it going for so long, there's always some component of anger, and sometimes that's the biggest part. In relation to grief, we often hear the phrase, time heals all wounds. Well, that means that as memories fade in intensity and new patterns emerge to replace or compensate for the old ones, there tends to be less and less resistance to what happens. That's why, as a tradition in many places in the world, the person goes into mourning for a year or more. And this kind of healing, just letting time pass, works for many, many people. Okay? That's why it keeps being done. But actual grieving time can be greatly relieved or shortened. I mean the hurtful part of it. Okay? To the degree that we can accept the loss as a fact of life. This is what keeps a lot of people going with it, because they don't or they won't. But to the degree that we can accept it as a fact of life, however unpleasant, it can be greatly prolonged by continually thinking that the loss shouldn't have happened, even though it did. And that shouldn't, but it did, but it shouldn't have, but it did, but it shouldn't have, keeps a tremendous amount of tension, which is a form of anger at the fact that it did. Okay? Grieving time can also be shortened by remembering the good things about what is no longer there, whether it's a person or situation or something else. And of course, it can be lengthened by dwelling on the bad effects of the absence. Right? That comes down to personal habit and choice. Right? But if you can consciously bring the good things to focus and take pleasure in those good things, it lessens all the pain of it. When anger is involved, some process of forgiveness is really, really helpful. It'll help the healing. In the story just told, okay, grieving can be healed or relieved when we become motivated or involved in a solution to the loss or in a new project that compensates for it. It's also possible, just want to tell you it's possible, to heal the physical reactions and the symptoms and the mental reactions of grief and loss by changing the state of our mind and changing the state of our body with certain kinds of techniques that bring us into the present moment and make the change. One of them is one we teach called Dynamind. There's one called an emotional freedom technique. There's a number of these different kinds of techniques that help change mind and body in the present moment and have remarkably good results. The important thing to remember in all of this that we're talking about is that grief is not a bad thing. Okay? It's natural to have it. It's natural to feel it from time to time when our thoughts bring up memories of someone or something that's no longer there. But it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to keep us from being happy most of the time or whenever we can. So now, with that discussion of it, do we have any questions or comments? Give you some thinking time.
So there's really no right or wrong amount of time to be grieving?
No. The right or wrongness would be the effect it has on you, on your health and your ability to live, and on the people around you. Okay? But you can't say that it should only be for 1 month or whatsoever. That's not appropriate.
So in some of the Hawaiian stories, they talked about bashing out their teeth so that they could get over the grief and move on with life.
Some people, let's talk about some of the customs that people have. One of the most common customs that we know of is still popular in the Latin countries, is especially a wife or a mother, and sometimes the man will do this. They'll wear black for a year or more. Some of them for the rest of their life, depending on the particular culture, okay? As a sign of mourning. And because this is thought to be a proper respect for the person who's gone. On the other hand, the Irish hold a wake, which is a party, and they invite the deceased person. So the deceased person is there in the coffin, and everybody's having a big party and drinking and laughing and telling jokes and singing bawdy songs to help the person who's gone be happier too. And then when that's over and he's in the ground, they forget about it, except every once in a while we remember something good about it. There's a radically different approach. In some cultures, like I said, it's important that there be signs of mourning, even when there isn't exact mourning. The Chinese, I'll say ancient Chinese, had a whole bunch of gods. And one of the gods of happiness and luck was a man who had his head bent. He had old clothes on, and he had a cane. So when they pictured him, you know, they had a paper cane and rags around it and always looking down. And yet that was a god of luck and happiness. But in the story about that god, his mother had died. And it was not appropriate for a young man whose mother had died to stand up straight and with his head up and look at the world and look happy. Okay? So that seemed kind of odd, but that had to do with appearance. In the ancient Hawaiian culture, it also was very important that there be a sign of mourning. At least important to some people and at some periods and depending on their relationship. So one of the things was mentioned that would be done when someone died. The person would go to a rock and bash their own teeth out and leave them hanging bloody and out. And that showed how sad they were at the loss. And another thing they did, what was quite painful, would be have their tongue tattooed. There would be a pattern tattooed all along the length of the tongue. And so that would be a continual reminder of how sad they felt at the loss. Okay? And then in some places, you probably have heard about this, the people who lost someone aren't all that sad, so they hire mourners. Okay? And so they'll hire people to wail and beat their hands and tear their clothing and in front of the funeral procession. Okay? So that everybody knows they are really sad. Okay? All kinds of different customs. Yes?
Did the ancient Hawaiians, how did they think of like spirits? Could they commune with their ancestors?
Okay, that's a good question. If there's one thing we can say about Hawaiians in general, and including ancient Hawaiians, there's nothing we can say.
They didn't have an afterlife.
No, that's not so. No, that's not so. When I said what I just said, what I mean is you can't say one thing about all Hawaiians. Okay? One of the famous writers about Hawaiian culture who wrote during the time of transition, a man named David Malo. And he said several times in describing, he said, in the morning, people would take their gourd, a special gourd that represented the god Lono, and would take a bite out of some food that was stored there, and as a sign of respect to Lono and as a kind of a promise for abundance in the crops, except for some people who didn't. And then he goes on, he said, when the fishermen went down, they would go fishing and they would have this special altar, and they came back and they would put a fish on top of it as an offering to Ku'ula, the god of fishing, except for those who didn't. So over and over again, he has to add this little thing because not everybody did the same thing in the same way. So in terms of the afterlife, there were those who thought of, if you were a good person, your aumakua. Now, aumakua is a special word that has a number of meanings, like most important words in Hawaiian. And one of the meanings it has refers to ancestors. Okay? It can refer to a guardian spirit, it can refer to one's own personal spirit, but most of the time in common conversation, it's either a guardian in an animal form or an ancestor. So if you were a good person, your ancestor would come and take your spirit up into this beautiful land where you would live happily ever after. And if you weren't, why, you'd be left to roam the earth like an earthbound spirit until you could find your way to a special temple on the east side of the island, on the west side of the island, and on all the Polynesian islands had these temples. Okay? And on that part of the island, the spirit would climb a breadfruit tree and sit in a branch until the branch rotted and fell down, and they would fall down into the underworld. Or the inner world, again, depending. So that was another one. Another approach was that and we see this in the Pele legend, everybody who died goes into a place that resembles the Greek Hades quite a bit, okay? Where it's dull and unhappy, and the only thing you have to eat are moths, and sounds a lot like Hades. But that was another tradition. Okay? So there were different kinds. And there was another tradition, I'll just name one more, and that was that you would go to a special place when you died, and from there, if you were wise enough, you'd choose what you were going to do next, because some of the Hawaiians believed in reincarnation. And if you weren't wise enough, somebody would come along and take you to where you could learn how to be wise enough. Okay? So there's lots of variations. Yeah.
How do you deal with grief is mixed with guilt? A lot of times people feel guilty about being left behind, or...
Sure, of course. You have to understand this, and this is how the two come together. Guilt is a form of anger directed at oneself for something you should have done but didn't, or should not have done but did. And it's that should thing again. That's where guilt comes from. It's self-directed anger. So again, some process of forgiveness or mind-body change will relieve and completely get rid of that. Human beings are so curious and sometimes complicated, however, and by complicated, they can come up with all kinds of different ideas for doing something. We have two primary urges. This is worth another session, but I'll bring it up here. Primary urges. One is to love and be loved, and another one is to empower and be empowered. And those fundamentally govern all our actions. The thing that makes them particularly distinct are ideas we have about love and about power and empowerment. Okay? So those two urges can have a good outcome for you and the people around you, or they can have a bad outcome for you and the people around you, depending on those other things. So I'm bringing this up now because some people get a hit of power or a loving attraction of loving help by feeling bad. Some people do it through guilt, some people do it through sickness, some people do it through helplessness, but it gives a little bit of hit of power and a little bit of attracting attention and sympathy, for a while anyway, that some people become addicted to that. And in that case, they're using the guilt or the grief to get something else that they want. Human beings can do that. And when that's the case, those are the hardest ones to help, because they have to have a real strong motivation to do it differently, okay, to get their power and to get their love in a different way. And that's a challenge.
Any advice on meeting that challenge?
Well, to the degree that you're able as a friend or a healer, helping them first of all to get into a very deep state of relaxation in the present moment, because in that state they will be more ready to listen to an alternative that can provide the basic feeling they want. See? The more tension they're under, the less they'll listen. The more relaxed they are, the more open they will be to listening. That's not a guarantee, but the more open they will be. If you can, then your challenge is, if you're a helper, your challenge is to come up, knowing that person, come up with something that would interest them and would, in their mind, give them a promise of a better way to get what they want. Okay. All right. Anything else?
So, I'm going back to that thing about time, about how long for grieving, because if you're really in tune with your body, you can start to feel when it's not helping you, it's not relieving tension, it's actually causing tension. But what if you're not so in tune with your body and it feels like it's helping, but it's going on a long time? And
well, if it's going on a long time without ceasing and it's interfering with your ability to be happiness or with your relationships or with your life in some way, then you know you need help if you can't do it yourself.
because I've seen over the course of my life different intensities and different lengths, and it depends on who's dying. But I lost a cat not long ago and was really not able to function for a whole day. I would say just this feeling of sadness. And I didn't
It's not a
know-
long time.
It's not, but it was a whole day. Now, if you looked at your life and said, do I want to not have productivity for a whole day? You would say no.
Okay. Now,
How to speed up
if you're in a position where you really want to get rid of the feeling faster, okay? First thing I would recommend would be Dynamite. Dynamite is a fast healing technique. It will heal emotions. It will heal pain and a lot of other sensations very fast. It is in a blue booklet that you can all have, or write to us and we'll send you one. But that's if you consciously are willing to give up the grief.
Because here there's a part of me that even as I say it, well, a day's okay, but really...
Well, like I said, if that's not what you want, there are ways to change that.
You've got to work with your beliefs about how much you love somebody that's gone.
No, and loving and grieving are different. You don't grieve because the person's gone. You grieve because the situation has changed and you're uncomfortable with that and you don't like it. Okay? Let me give you another thing about the way grieving was done in ancient Hawaii. Sometimes you couldn't tell the difference between how the Hawaiians who acted when someone went on a long journey over the horizon, out of sight and out of your life, or when they died. It was the same thing. They're not here. Life is different. Life is not the same. I can't talk to them. I can't hug them. I can't interact with them. It's just the same as being dead. And so they would mourn in a ritual or dramatic way. It's just in the same way. This happened when the king and queen left to go to England. As it turned out, they died there. But the point was that they grieved when the ship was over the horizon. Okay? So, yeah, there's all kinds of circumstances that will happen that will produce this, but the grief is for the loss. Okay? To remember a person with love, you don't have to grieve. To recall the good times, to recall their presence, to actually use your vivid memory to bring it up so that they're sitting with you and having a conversation. That doesn't have to be grief. Grief is always in regard to the loss. If you, every once in a while, something reminds you, a song, a smell, something somebody says, an old habit, and that reminds you of the person, some moments of sadness, which is a light form of grief, or some moments of grieving, okay? It's natural, okay? And then you still have a life to live. It isn't natural when you don't let it go. Yeah. Yes?
Another example of that is even when, in my life, when my father made a different choice, which made reality completely different, or like when you get divorced, another person's still alive. I think sometimes that can be harder to get over than someone dying even, because there's still a possibility of
getting back together. And so the pain of that separation is another form of grieving. That's right. Yes, it is. Right?
So this reminds me of Buddhism when I talk about attachment.
Of what?
Attachment.
Yes, remind you of what?
Well, grieving in Buddhism.
Oh, Buddhism, yes, right.
Because
That's true. That's right.
It's very similar.
It's very similar.
The suffering
comes from the attachment.
Right.
The attachment is an addiction to something where you feel you cannot survive or cannot live or cannot be happy without this thing, whether it's a person or whether it's money or whether it's whatever it might be. And Buddhism teaches a beautiful lesson of not of getting rid of the thing. A lot of people mistake that. They think it means don't have any money or don't care. And that's not what it's about. It's about caring without addiction. That's what compassion, that's why the Buddhists teach compassion too. It's caring and acting and helping without being addicted to the outcome or addicted to how the person acts or addicted to how you're treated. That's what that's about. It's the addiction to get rid of. Yes?
Would you tell us your definition of addiction?
Okay, I'll say it again. Addiction is where you have the idea, and from the idea, the feeling, that you cannot be happy without something. Okay? And that can translate into you cannot function. There's a beautiful song, which is an addiction song. Okay? A lot of people you have heard. I can't live without you. I can't sleep, I can't dream. That's addiction. Okay? That's the nature of it. Okay? When you don't have that, I read about, along these lines, an experiment that's totally unethical and illegal that was done by a group in Vietnam during the war, where they gave high doses of heroin to some of the locals and then took them off it, cold turkey. There were no symptoms. They had no history of it. They felt the effects of the drug, but they didn't feel any effects of withdrawal. Now, that was interesting. And that would have happened because they were not addicted to the good effects that they were feeling. They had them, and then they didn't have them. See? So even when we're talking about that kind of an addiction, it's not, it all depends on how much you feel you lost or need what you don't have. That's why it's mostly people who get addicted are people with very low self-esteem, who need something to bolster them up.
Is the word, in our culture, the word addiction is a negative polarity, but it's not always true. If addiction simply means choice, and making the same choice over and over again, then couldn't we be addicted to aloha if we kept making the choice for aloha over and over again? Mm-hmm.
Technically, yes, but people don't always use words in their technical meaning. And there's where we got almost always addiction is associated with not being able to function well without it. Okay? But technically, you're right. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, yes.
And please, would you say something about this kind of grief, but when there is awareness in what is happening, but still it's very hard to go through the process.
Yeah, yeah.
So, do you have any suggestions? Because yeah.
Okay. Remember this, and this might help to remind you. The pain comes from resisting what happened. That's the only thing that makes it hard. Now, depending on your ideas about what you don't have anymore, it can be very hard to change that. If you have identified with someone so very strongly, if you have become dependent on something, some behavior or action or quality of them, speaking particularly with people now, changing that pattern can be very difficult. This is why some kind of technique to explore whether forgiveness is needed is very good, but also to explore the possibility of learning how to become totally relaxed in the present moment and then changing your mind about it. Trying to change your mind about it while the feeling is there is extremely hard. Getting into a state where you are focused and relaxed and not thinking of anything else, and then choosing to change your mind, makes it a lot easier. Yeah. Okay.
I thought that anger and fear were, I thought that anger was hidden fear.
Not always. Both of those, well, let's put it this way. Usually, anger is about the past. You can imagine that the past will happen again and get angry about it, but it's really about the past. Fear is about the future. And the fear is that you won't be able to handle something, won't know what to do, will be helpless in some fashion, okay? So fear is always about the future, and because we're such creative beings, we can imagine something in the past that we might not have been able to do anything about and get afraid. Okay? So, but basically, you're angry about something that happened that shouldn't have happened. And you're fearful about something that might happen that you won't be able to do anything about.
So forgiveness.
So forgiveness, let's make it real clear. Forgiveness is about changing how you think and how you feel in a way that lets you think about it with no bad feeling. Okay? It's not the words, unless the words help. It's the thinking and feeling. And when that changes in a way that what happened no longer bothers you, not suppressing it, so it really no longer bothers you, forgiveness has happened. Okay. Angel, would you come up? I'd like Gloria to lead the healing.
Aloha, everybody. Hello. And Happy New Year. Okay, since it's the new year, we're going to think about this new year. But before we do, just sort of take a deep breath, get relaxed, breathe in this wonderful volcano air, clean, clear, energizing, and look at the beautiful rock that you're holding and share your energy with this rock or stone or shell. And give it a compliment. Tell it how wonderful it is. And at the same time, give yourself a compliment. And tell yourself how wonderful you are. Okay, now I'd like you to just close your eyes. We're going to go on a little adventure into our inner garden. And this is a very beautiful place that you create. You can have anything you want in this garden. Flowers, trees, waterfall, birds, whatever you love. This is a very special place just for you. So look around your beautiful garden and see something that you really like. And then listen. What do you hear in your garden? Birds, water. And smell something. Find something that smells really good in your garden. There's probably a special flower there that's very fragrant. Well, in your garden, you do have a beautiful crystal clear pool. And by this pool is a wonderful new chair, your favorite kind of chair, that's just there waiting for you to sit in. So go and sit in your chair and just take a breath and relax and feel how nice this new chair feels. And next to it is a table with a gift. And this gift is a calendar that says 2012. And guess what? There's nothing in this calendar. This is your year for you to write whatever you want in this calendar. So open this calendar and decide, well, would I like to take a trip this year? When would I like to take this trip? And turn to the month when you might like to do this. Or is there some other activity that you would like to do? Because this is your year and your calendar. And it's up to you to decide what you would like to do, what you might like to be, what you might like to have, and when you want it. So write it in your calendar so it can manifest. And this is going to be a fun year because this is the year of the dragon And the dragon represents success and prosperity and wonderful adventures. And the pen that you have to write this in has multiple colors, so you can write your goal in gold or silver or red or blue or green. You can color code your activities so they will stand out and you will remember what they are. So think about your wonderful year that you're going to have. Things that you want to do, you are going to do this year. Thank the universe for this wonderful, wonderful year of fun and adventure and success that you are going to have. And if it works out different, that's okay. Change is good. We cannot have change without change. And so be ready. Be ready for some really good change. It's okay if it's different. All right, give yourself another compliment and tell yourself, yes, I can. I can do this. I can have this. Thank you, universe. Thank you for all my friends, my family, for my wonderful life, and for all the wonderful tools that I have to achieve what I want in this life. Amama. Huna. Come back and take a deep breath and breathe that energy back into this rock as we're going to put it in the basket so everything can party and manifest what we want.
Hello.
And the party has started.